In the state of Alabama, for over a century, hundreds of death row inmates have been led into the execution chamber. Every step, every last breath, is recorded, cold and precise, like the schedule of a machine. But between death row and the lethal injection room, they are given one final privilege, a last meal, and a final word. Some choose fast food. Some choose silence. Some curse until the very end. Others whisper, "I'm sorry." These are true stories of killers, of scheduled deaths, and of final moments that most people would never dare to face directly. If you're drawn to real stories of crime and justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss our next videos. And now, let's explore the final moments of death row inmates in Alabama. 1. Derrick Ryan Dearman, Alabama. On August 20th, 2016, the quiet town of Citronelle, Alabama was torn apart by a horrific massacre. Derrick Ryan Dearman, just 29 years old, took the lives of 5 people, including a pregnant woman, in just a few hours. Fear and shock spread throughout the town as the victims' bodies were discovered in a silent house. The brutality Dearman inflicted didn't just leave a painful wound in the lives of the families involved. It raised a chilling question about the existence of crime in such a small town. Though arrested, the case continued to haunt the public. Throughout his trial, Dearman maintained his innocence. But the undeniable evidence and his cruelty left every defense meaningless. On October 17, 2024, after years of fighting his sentence, he was executed by lethal injection. For his final meal, Dearman was served a dish from a local restaurant: fried catfish, fried shrimp, boiled shrimp, fried oysters, crispy onion rings, stuffed crab, and 2 sides. A meal he would never taste again, but a small comfort in his last moments. When asked for his last words, he whispered calmly to the victim's family, "Forgive me. This is not for me. It is for you. I've taken so much. To my family, y'all already know. I love y'all." An apology that could never bring back 5 lives. Dearman left quietly, but the wounds he left behind will never heal. 2. John Lewis Evans III, Alabama. On January 5, 1977, in Mobile, Alabama, a botched robbery ended with the death of Edward Nasser, a pawn shop owner. John Lewis Evans III murdered Nasser during the robbery, shocking not only the community with his brutality but also with the senselessness of his actions. There was no clear motive, just greed and desire that drove him to commit such a horrific act. Nasser, a man simply living his life, never imagined that death was approaching. Evans was arrested, and his cruelty was undeniable through multiple trials. On April 22, 1983, despite his claims of having no malice or hatred, Evans faced the death penalty. The death of Edward Nasser and the consequences of Evans' actions could never be changed, no matter how many justifications or regrets came afterward. On April 22, before stepping into his final moments, Evans requested a simple meal that reflected his humility: a dinner of shrimp. A modest choice, but enough to satisfy his last request. Nothing extravagant, just shrimp, something to hold onto as he walked towards the end. His last words, "I have no malice for anyone, no hatred for anyone," were chilling in their calmness. A man who denied hatred but couldn't deny what he had caused. Evans' death didn't bring peace to anyone, for in those words, there was only coldness, an eerie calmness from a man who had taken a loved one from a family, a life lost in vain. Were his last words the truth, or just a way to justify himself before it was all over? 3. Demetrius Terrence Frazier, Alabama. On November 27, 1991, Birmingham, Alabama greeted a cold late autumn day. In that chill, not just from the weather but from fate itself, Pauline Brown, 40, stepped out of her workplace, unaware that it would be the last time she would see the sky above her hometown. She was shot dead in a bold robbery, the culprit, Demetrius Terrence Frazier. A year later, nearly 1,000 miles away in Michigan, Frazier continued his crime spree. This time, the victim was a 14-year-old girl named Crystal Kendrick. Her death shook the community, but it also led to Frazier being sentenced to life in prison in Michigan. But Alabama hadn't forgotten, and the state pursued justice for Pauline Brown. Nearly 3 decades later, Alabama's death sentence was carried out. On February 6, 2025, Demetrius Frazier became the second person in the United States to be executed by a new method, nitrogen hypoxia, a form of execution that remains controversial. The night before his death, Frazier requested a distinctly American last meal, a 5-layer beef burrito, a chicken chalupa, crispy tacos, fries, salsa, and a Mountain Dew, all from Taco Bell. A fast meal, full of salt and fat, much like his swift and brutal life. Before the mask was placed over his face and his breath was taken away, Frazier spoke clearly and decisively. Detroit strong, I love everybody on death row, and his final words, let's go. No justifications. No regrets. Frazier left as he lived, fast, decisive, and leaving gaps that no one would ever fill. 4. Keith Edmund Gavin, Alabama. On the morning of March 6, 1998, 68-year-old William Clayton Jr., a contract delivery worker, withdrew money from an ATM in downtown Center. In an unexpected moment, he was shot dead, in broad daylight, in the heart of Alabama. The perpetrator, Keith Edmund Gavin, a man who had just been released on parole after serving 16 years for a murder in Illinois. Free, but unchanged, Gavin had returned to his old ways with brutal force. The case quickly closed with overwhelming evidence. The community had no doubts. A death sentence was handed down, and Gavin waited for over 2 decades before facing his final moments. On July 18, 2024, Gavin entered the execution room. He didn't request an extravagant last meal, choosing instead sour cream-flavored potato chips, ice cream, and a Mountain Dew. No excess, no flair, just familiar comfort food, like a simple, unremarkable end to a troubled life. Before the needle began its final task, Gavin said, I love my family. No elaboration. No explanation. Just 3 words, enough to end all the noise. A declaration of love, but it could not erase the blood. Gavin left quietly, as if this ending had been said long ago. 5. Carey Dale Grayson, Alabama. On February 21, 1994, Vicky W. was on a journey to visit her mother in Louisiana. Little did she know, that day's ride would be her final one. In Jefferson County, Alabama, she was offered a lift by 19-year-old Carey Dale Grayson and 3 of his friends. But instead of taking her to her destination, they drove her to a remote forested area. That's where the brutality began. Vicky was tortured and then murdered. Her body was tossed down a cliff. And as if that wasn't enough, they went on to spend her money like it was a trophy. Grayson was arrested and sentenced to death. For over 3 decades, he lived in a limbo between justice and darkness, between lost youth and an inevitable sentence. On November 21, 2024, Alabama carried out the execution using a new method, nitrogen hypoxia. For his final meal, Grayson chose food from local restaurants: soft tacos, a beef burrito, tostada, fries, guacamole, and a Mountain Dew Baja Blast. A meal that embodied American youth, but this time, it was for a final night. When the microphone was turned on for his final words, Grayson stared directly at the warden, Terry Rabin. His last words were not apologies, not regrets, just insult. Yeah, for you, expletive, off, for the rest of you, and then the microphone was turned off. He left with hostility, as if death were his final rebellion, unplanned and sudden. The silence that followed was colder than the nitrogen gas that ended his life. 6. James Barney Hubbard, Alabama. In early 1977, in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, 46-year-old James Barney Hubbard shot and killed 62-year-old Lillian Montgomery, a woman who had taken him in after he was released from prison for an earlier murder. They had lived together, shared drinks, and an old past that seemed long forgotten. But in an instant, that past came rushing back. Hubbard claimed she had committed suicide. The police didn't believe him. Investigations confirmed he was the one who pulled the trigger. Hubbard was sentenced to death. And then, time passed. By the time his sentence was carried out, he was 74 years old, becoming the oldest person to be executed in Alabama since the death penalty was reinstated in the U.S. The question arose, does justice have an expiration date? On August 5, 2004, His death was carried out by lethal injection. Before his death, Hubbard requested a meal that spoke of time: 2 soft-boiled eggs, 4 slices of bacon, red tomatoes, fried green tomatoes, pineapple slices with mayonnaise, white bread, a banana, and a bottle of V8 juice. A meal fit for an old man preparing for a regular day. Before closing his eyes, he said just one short sentence: "I love my family." No justification. No sign of regret. Just a message, soft as his final breath. 7. Andrew Reid Lackey, Alabama. On Halloween night in 2005, while children were trick-or-treating, one man chose to embody a real demon. Andrew Reid Lackey, 22 years old, armed with a gun and knife, broke into the home of 80-year-old Charles Newman in Limestone County, Alabama. His target wasn't a trick or a joke, it was treasure. He believed Newman was hiding gold and cash. When Newman called 911, Lackey became frantic. Shot during the confrontation, Lackey didn't flee. Instead, in a blind act of revenge, he stabbed Newman nearly 70 times, then shot him in the chest. The case closed quickly. The motive, the psychology, were all dissected, but no answers were found. In 2013, Lackey waived his right to appeal and requested that his execution proceed. On July 25, 2015, Andrew Lackey became the first person executed in Alabama after a 2-year hiatus. Before his death, he requested a simple meal: smoked turkey, fries, and a grilled cheese sandwich. A meal for someone too young to fully grasp that death was waiting. Lackey didn't speak. No apology. No defense. No closing words. Just a cold, quiet moment, like the very crime he committed. 8. Rhonda Belle Martin, Alabama. Born in the early 20th century, Rhonda Belle Martin was the epitome of a Southern woman, simple in appearance, a devoted housewife, living quietly in a small town in Alabama. But beneath that seemingly harmless exterior was a deadly secret no one could have imagined. From her mother, to 2 husbands, and 3 of her 7 children, all had mysteriously passed away. The cause of death was often recorded as illness or food poisoning. But when her 4th husband, Claude Carroll Martin, died in 1951, and the medical records no longer hid the truth, all eyes turned to Rhonda. In March of 1956, she confessed to poisoning her victims with rat poison. But later, she retracted part of her statement, claiming she was confused. Public opinion divided. Some believed she was mentally ill, while others saw a cold, calculating mind behind every act. On October 11, 1957, in Alabama, Rhonda Belle Martin was executed in the electric chair. One of the few women in the U.S. to be executed by this method. Before her death, she requested a simple meal: a hamburger, mashed potatoes, waffles, and coffee. No frills. No special requests. Much like her final words, none. She entered the execution room in silence. No pleas. No confession. Just the distant gaze of a woman carrying secrets that, perhaps, are still not fully understood. 9. Alan Eugene Miller, Alabama. On August 5, 1999, in Pelham, Alabama, a normal workday turned into a nightmare. Alan Eugene Miller, a quiet, reserved man, suddenly became the center of an office massacre. In less than an hour, 3 men, Lee Holdbrooks, Christopher Yancey, and Terry Jarvis, fell after Miller coldly shot them. 6 shots for Holdbrooks. 3 shots for Yancey. 5 shots for Jarvis. Why? Miller believed they were spreading rumors about him. The whispers in the office, whether true or not, triggered an uncontrollable response. The case was tried quickly, and the death sentence was handed down. But the execution didn't go smoothly. In 2022, Alabama attempted to execute Miller by lethal injection, but it failed. His body, either too healthy or too resistant, became an obstacle. Miller lived another 2 years. On September 26, 2024, the state tried again, this time using nitrogen gas. A quieter, colder death, and one that has yet to be fully proven in terms of pain. Before leaving his cell, Miller was served a simple meal: a steak, baked potato, and fries. A heavy, unremarkable meal, much like the way he ended the lives of 3 other men. When asked for his last words, he said, "I didn't do anything to be here." No further explanation. No justification. Just a denial that echoed in a room where the truth had long been decided. 10. Jamie Ray Mills, Alabama. On the night of June 24, 2004, in Gwynn, Alabama, Jamie Ray Mills and his wife Joanne were high on drugs. Hungry, tired, and out of control. They went to their neighbor's house, 87-year-old Floyd Hill and 72-year-old Vera Hill, asking to borrow the phone. The door opened with kindness. But within minutes, everything turned bloody. Jamie attacked Floyd with whatever he could find: a machete, a tire iron, and even a hammer. When Vera rushed in, she became the next victim. The Mills couple ransacked the house, taking $140 and some prescription pills. 2 lives were traded for an insignificant amount of money. Jamie was arrested and sentenced to death. For years, he neither denied nor asked for mercy. On his execution day, May 30th, 2024, he chose a final meal true to his southern roots: 3 large shrimp, 2 fillets of catfish, 3 oysters, onion rings, and a stuffed crab. A meal that reminded him of the land that raised him and where his life would come to an end. Before the lethal injection began, Jamie looked at his family and said, his voice trembling but clear, "I love my family. I love my brother and sister. I couldn't ask for anything more. I love y'all. Carry on." A late goodbye, not to the victims, but to his family. Death came gently, but the guilt did not. 11. Walter Leroy Moody Jr., Alabama. On December 16, 1989, a package was left on the doorstep of Federal Judge Robert S. Vance's home in Mountain Brook, Alabama. No one suspected anything until he opened it. In an instant, the house was engulfed in the flash of an explosion. Vance died on the spot. A murder delivered by mail, right in the heart of America. The perpetrator was Walter Leroy Moody Jr., a man who harbored deep resentment against the justice system after multiple failed appeals. No longer believing in justice, he chose to bring it down from the inside, with blood and metal. Moody didn't just kill a judge. He also sent 3 other bombs to legal offices and civil rights organizations. Fortunately, those bombs were discovered before they detonated. More than 3 decades later, when he was escorted to the execution chamber, Moody was 83 years old, becoming the oldest person to be executed in Alabama since the death penalty was reinstated in the U.S. On his final night, he didn't request any special meal. But he did share 2 Philly cheese sandwiches, a bag of potato chips, 2 cans of Dr. Pepper, a bag of M&Ms, and an almond Hershey bar, with 2 attorneys and 3 friends. Moody did not speak his final words. No parting statement. Just a lingering silence, much like the bombs he sent without a return address. He died as a distorted symbol of vengeance, cruel, silent, and utterly cold. 12. Kenneth Eugene Smith, Alabama. In 1988, 45-year-old Elizabeth Sennett was found dead at her home in Colbert County, Alabama. Initially, the police suspected a robbery gone wrong. But the truth quickly unraveled. Reverend Charles Sennett Sr., Elizabeth's husband, had hired someone to kill his wife to avoid financial ruin and the revelation of an affair. The hired hand, Kenneth Eugene Smith, and an accomplice. They broke into the house under the guise of land surveying. Elizabeth had no idea, and just minutes later, she would never wake up again. A week later, Reverend Sennett took his own life. But Smith was caught, convicted, and sentenced to death, waiting nearly 35 years on death row. On January 25, 2024, Alabama executed Smith using a method never before used: nitrogen hypoxia. This was the first time this method was employed, not just in the U.S., but globally. Due to the novel and risky nature of the method, Smith's final meal was scheduled for 10 a.m. He had T-bone steak, fries, toast with gravy, and eggs, and was prohibited from drinking anything after 4 p.m. to prevent vomiting while the mask was placed on his face. As his final moments arrived, Kenneth Smith chose not to remain silent. He said, "Tonight, Alabama takes humanity a step back. I leave with love, with peace, and light. Thank you all for your support. It wasn't just a farewell, it was a statement. For history. For those who still believe that death can wash away a wrong decision. He died beneath a mask, without sound. But what he left behind continues to echo. 13. Domineque Hakim Marcelle Ray, Alabama. A quiet massacre unfolded in the heart of Selma, once a symbol of the civil rights movement. But Domineque Ray didn't leave his mark for justice. He left behind deaths. Reinhard and Ernest Mabins, two brothers who lived in the same neighborhood, were killed simply because they refused to join the gang Ray and his accomplice Marcus Ouden were forming. The price of defiance was a death sentence. But that wasn't all. Ray was also convicted of kidnapping and killing Tiffany Harville, a 15-year-old girl. On a summer night in 1995, she disappeared without a trace. Her body was found days later. Ray was charged. And then, sentenced. In 2019, nearly 24 years after Tiffany's murder, Alabama decided to carry out the execution. On February 7th, Domineque Ray entered the execution chamber. There was no special meal. Just a regular breakfast. Milk, eggs, jelly, biscuits, prunes, and potatoes. Things that perhaps couldn't mask the weight on anyone's mind as they walked toward death. Ray requested an Islamic cleric to be with him in his final moments. But Alabama refused. The law only allowed a Christian chaplain to be present. Ray was executed without his spiritual companion. No final words. Just forced silence, caught between the lines of law and faith. 14. Matthew Reeves, Alabama. On November 27, 1996, a car broke down on the side of the road in Selma. 3 men had planned to rob a drug dealer, but now they needed help. Willie Johnson Jr. stopped his truck, just a kind gesture. And fate intervened. He helped them, then drove them to Reeves' home. Upon arrival, there were no thanks. Reeves pulled out a gun, shot Johnson, and stole his money. A kind man died because of brutal randomness. His body was found the next morning, still in the truck, nameless and silent. Reeves was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. Over the years, several appeals were filed, arguing his mental capacity and ability to understand his sentence. But in the end, all efforts failed. On January 27, 2022, his sentence was carried out. Reeves didn't request a special meal. Just a bottle of Sprite. No final words. No explanations. Just the sound of a soda can being opened in the heavy room. A small sound, marking the end of a tragedy that no one could stop. 15. Thomas Warren Whisenhant, Alabama. Thomas Warren Whisenhant is a name that haunted South Alabama for over a decade. It all began in 1963, when, at just 16 years old, he took his first life. 72-year-old Lexi Haynes, shot directly in the head. This was no accident. It was the beginning of what would later be known as the signature of a serial killer. He continued his killing spree throughout the 1970s, targeting women in Mobile. Cheryl Payton was the most notable victim, murdered in October of 1976. Some other victims were never identified, leaving only cold fragments and police records. On October 17, 1976, Whisenhant was arrested after confessing to the murders. He was sentenced to death, beginning a journey that would span more than 32 years on death row, the longest in Alabama's history at that time. On May 27, 2010, his sentence was carried out. Before his death, Whisenhant chose a nostalgic meal: fried chicken, French fries, American cheese, orange juice, coffee, and chocolate pudding. When asked for his last words, he whispered, "I'm sorry for what I've done. I know I've hurt so many people. I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused." No justifications. No evasions. Just an old man, bowing his head before what he should have faced long ago. 16. Nathaniel Woods, Alabama. On June 17, 2004, in Birmingham, Alabama, a police raid turned into a tragedy. 3 officers were killed while entering an apartment to arrest Nathaniel Woods under a warrant. The shooter wasn't Woods, but another man, Carey Spencer. However, this did not save Nathaniel from a death sentence. The court concluded that he had lured the officers into the trap, knowing blood would be spilled. Despite not firing the gun, Woods was sentenced to death as an accomplice. From the start, the case sparked controversy. Many believed Nathaniel had no intention of killing anyone. Calls for a stay of execution came from both civil rights activists and the public, but they were in vain. On March 5, 2020, Woods entered the execution chamber, while protests outside continued. Before his execution, he was served his final meal: sweet potatoes, spinach, chicken nuggets, a chicken leg, baked apples, French fries, 2 oranges, and orange juice. A colorful meal, in stark contrast to the gray of his fate. Nathaniel Woods said nothing. He remained calm, as if ready. And then, it all ended. But the questions remain unanswered, about justice, about complicity, and about the fragile boundaries of guilt. The final meals, the last words, sometimes filled with remorse, sometimes with cold silence. Each death row inmate is a different slice of crime and justice in Alabama. What do you think? Is late remorse meaningful? Leave a comment below and join the discussion. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell to make sure you don't miss the next stories from Crimes Unearthed 911. See you next time.